Teachers, greetings. I hope all is well. I am resuming our instructional video series. You may remember last school year, we received instructional videos about every 2 weeks, sometimes every 3 weeks, of just practical strategies that you could implement in your class just to make sure that you were addressing all your students and to make sure that you were addressing all the learning styles. And so as we are on the brink of returning back to school, I thought it would be necessary and appropriate to resume these instructional videos, hoping to assist you in your pedagogy and in your instructional practices in your classroom. This particular video, though, I want to talk to you about remediation. As we all know, our students have not actually physically been in the building since last March. And so when we look at it that way, that's a long time. Though we have put a lot of effort into our virtual strategies, though we put a lot of effort into our virtual learning, we really don't have a full glimpse or a full assessment of what our students have retained and what our students have not retained. And so it's really important that as you begin to resume your in-person, face-to-face instruction, or as you may continue to operate in your virtual instruction, it's important that we keep remediation at the forefront of everything that we do. And so this video is really centered around and structured around making sure that you fully implement remediatory practices within your classroom instructional time. And so this is not one of those videos that's really going to tell you when to remediate, and this is not one of these videos that's going to tell you how to remediate. But this is an instructional video that's going to give you some assistance in what are some instructional practices and strategies that you may implement into what you're teaching. And so some of the things that I'll mention to you are not necessarily things that you've never heard of before, but they will be things that I think that will be really relevant to your instruction moving forth as we resume face-to-face instruction. And so one way to really garner an idea of if your students are grasping the content or the context of what you're teaching is by simple bell ringers, right? So when students return to your classroom, as soon as they enter into your classroom, it's going to be important that you have these structured parameters in place, because think about it, and honestly, we don't know this for certainty, but it's a possibility that our kids have not been part of a structured schedule that school produces, even though we know they've been logging on to into your classes. But because of that model, students have still been able to work through an asynchronous model. They've been able to go back on and rewatch your lectures. So some students still have learned in a non-traditional lens, which is not always a bad thing. But what I do want you to know is that as kids return to your classroom, it's going to be important that you greet them with a system or with their structure, something they can wrap their minds around, something of substance that they can kind of reintegrate into like their learning styles. And so a simple bell ringer is going to be important. The moment the kids enter your classroom, a bell ringer. That bell ringer might be something that is provoking a thought that will align with what you're teaching that day, or that bell ringer can be connected to something you taught the day before, right? So just a simple bell ringer. Sometimes, and again, these are all the same concepts, will have different names. You may call it a bell ringer, you may call it an icebreaker. I think it's always good to make sure that when you are teaching, that you don't just jump into your lecture, you don't just jump into what you're teaching, but you give some kind of icebreaker, trigger the consciousness or trigger the thought processes so that the students will have a gradual process into your lecture, right? So it's a way of it's almost like a KWL system, trying to figure out what the kids already know. So pose an icebreaker that might require them to recall information from a previous class, or it may require them to analyze information from a previous class or assess information from a previous class. An exit ticket is an excellent way to assess knowledge that the kids may have retained. So retention is going to be critical as our kids enter into the building to make sure that they are not only moving forward, but we're also not leaving them too far behind in terms of some of the learning gaps that may have happened since they've been away from us. So exit tickets can look like a lot of things. It can just be a simple question. It can be done technologically. It could just be done by way of a Google form, and it's just like, hey, answer this exit ticket question before you leave. Incorporate some teach like a champion techniques, like 100%. Before anybody can be released from class, we all have to make sure that we answer our exit tickets and submit it successfully. This will allow you to collect some real-time data So as you begin to be really intentional about your planning, as you begin to be intentional about how you plan to address like discrepancies and learning gaps, you have some real time data to really see if kids are really learning the standards, or if students are really progressing, or if they're regressing. Okay. Also, if you don't, even if you want to model your remediation around maybe not so much like assessment techniques, but it could just be turn and talks, right? Even though the kids are going to be socially distanced and spread out, it's like, hey, turn and talk to the person behind you, and because it's a safe space, talk about what we did yesterday. Remember, we talked about the four causes of the American Revolution. Talk about what those four causes were and what it meant to you, right? So turn and talk to your neighbor. 2 minutes and go, right? So that's a good opportunity, a good way for you to be able to trigger trigger that consciousness, trigger those thoughts, trigger some of those learning metrics that have went forth in your classroom. A pair and share, same thing. You want to make sure there's not going to be a whole lot of physical interaction between students in your classroom, but pair and share. All right. So after you do this icebreaker, or this bell ringer, or this essential question, or this I can statement, turn around and share that with the person that's sitting next to you or to your left. Right. So a pair and share. This is what I garnered from this essential question, and I read it to my partner, and my partner says, this is what I garnered from this essential question, and I read it from my partner, and now we pair and we share our ideas and we remediate each other. So the whole point is, and of course, as I just made a reference to, I can statements are really good. By the end of class, these are the 3 I can statements that I wanted to be able to say. I can rightfully identify the 4 causes of the American Revolution. I can identify who the first president of the United States were. I can identify who the Sons of Liberty were, right? So these are all excellent metrics and excellent items or ideas that you can use as you begin to integrate remediatory practices within your classroom. So again, welcome back, teachers. I hope that this has been helpful. And again, let's really focus on making sure that we're remediating our students as we move forward, as we apply rigor, and as we are growing our kids in academic capacity. Okay? Take care. Have a good day.